Hello again. This is the part 2 of my lecture on the connection between personality traits and leadership. If you haven't watched the part 1 of this video series, I would recommend that you watch that first before watching this one. Though you would still benefit watching this video directly because I'm covering different aspects of personality in these videos. But the first video will provide you the foundation of why personality traits matter in context of leadership. And I also go over certain personality traits connection with leadership. In this video, I will be primarily focusing on the Big Five personality factor model and the connection of those Big Five personality traits with leadership. Towards the end of the video, I will touch upon the Hexaco model as well, and talk about the connection of the sixth factor that is discussed in the Hexaco model and the connection of that sixth factor with leadership. So what are those big five personality traits? Well, you can see them here in this diagram. They are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. These five traits combined form the big five personality factor model. And it's very important that you not only understand what these factors mean, but also remember these personality traits. Not just from the exam perspective, though that would be important for you, but from a very practical perspective. If you understand what these big five personality traits are, it will give you deep insights into the nature of different people, including yourself. If you know how you are placed on these different dimensions, how somebody else with whom you are interacting is placed on these five personality dimensions, you essentially have a deeper knowledge about this person. You have greater insights about the person's pattern of thinking, about the person's pattern of feeling, as well as the pattern of behaving. And then, of course, you will be more effective in your interactions. You would remember that we define leadership as the process of influencing others to attain some common goal. Now, if you understand others really well, the people whom you are trying to influence, if you understand them really well, then of course, you would be able to modify your approach according to their personality traits. You can realize how then you will be more effective in your interaction. In this video though, I will be talking about personality traits more from the perspective of the leader. In other words, depending on where you stand on these dimensions, how effective or ineffective will you be as a leader? Now, given that these traits are really important, I should mention that that's a very easy way to remember these five traits, and that's the acronym OCEAN. O for openness, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion, A for agreeableness, and N for neuroticism. Now, why do we call these five traits as the big five personality traits? Is it because some famous psychologist thought that these are the five most important traits when it comes to understanding human beings? Some famous psychologist came up with this list? No. Because if we go that route, everyone will have their own list, right? When you come up with a list, you may come up with these five traits. Somebody else may think some another set of five traits which that person thinks is extremely important, right? So we will not have agreement on what are those five most important traits. So the way these 5 traits came into being is actually through a very organic process. And by that, what I mean is that researchers working in the area of personality, when they analyzed data that they had collected over decades, over several decades, and they ran that data through a statistical process called factor analysis, these are the 5 traits that always emerged through that analysis. And this happened not just in any one study, but in several studies across different disciplines. So when educational psychologists, for instance, are analyzing personality data, they find that these 5 traits are the ones that are always emerging in the factor analysis. When clinical psychologists, they are working on a different set of data, again, they come up with the same set of 5 personality traits. When social psychologists or organizational psychologists or industrial psychologists are working on their respective sets of data, everyone is coming up with these same set of 5 factors, right? So that is the reason we have come to realize that there are these 5 factors that explain the maximum amount of variance in people's behavior, in their way of thinking, in their way of feeling. So that is the reason we give a lot of importance to these 5 personality traits. I will explain the idea of factor analysis as well. I think you will be able to appreciate what I mean by that, because the factor analysis, if you are not familiar with statistics, may seem like some extremely complex process. Well, the statistical analysis part is complex, but the basic conception of the process is not necessarily that complex. So I will explain that in the next couple of slides. To appreciate factor analysis, let's take a look at this list of adjectives that could be used to describe people. This is not some official list, by the way. I just did a search on the internet, image search for adjectives for people, and that's what I found. So you have it here. Well, if I asked you to rate yourselves on each of these adjectives, say on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 meaning this particular adjective describes you perfectly, that's who you really are, and 1 meaning it's not at all like you, okay, that's just the opposite of who you are, then how would you rate yourselves on these adjectives? Okay, if I analyze your responses, I may notice certain patterns. Now, what do I mean by that? Say you rated yourself very high for the word amusing. You gave yourselves maybe 9 or 10 points there. So you are a very amusing person. Then if I look through the other adjectives, I may see certain patterns there. You may then have maybe have rated yourselves fairly high for the word attractive. Maybe you would have rated yourselves very high for the word charming. You would have rated yourselves very high probably again for the word confident. Again, likely very high for words like easygoing, maybe even energetic, exciting. So we are seeing some patterns here. We may see that you rated yourselves very high for humorous, as a likable person, and so on and so forth. I don't necessarily have to go through the maybe, well, I can see talkative. Okay, so we may see certain patterns here. We may see some patterns in the negative direction as well. For example, if you rated yourselves very high for the word amusing, then it is likely that you rated yourself really low for on the word boring. Right? You are an amusing person, meaning that you are not a boring person. So we end up seeing a pattern here. Now, if I do a similar kind of analysis, let's say for the second word here, which is what? Angry. So if you rated yourselves very high for the word angry, then probably you rated yourselves very high also for the word cruel. Maybe again, pretty high for dangerous. What else? Maybe again, very high or relatively high for the word horrible, for the word inconsiderate, and so on and so forth, right? So we are seeing some kind of pattern here. And when we analyze such patterns from the data that we have collected from a large group of people, we usually end up with 5 factors. And those 5 factors are those big 5 personality traits factors that I just mentioned. So, of course, depending on the analysis, you may get 10 factors or just 3 factors. Depends on how deep you want to do the analysis. But 5 factors seem to explain the maximum amount of variance in the personality traits of people. So if we make it 6 factors, the additional variance that 6 factors would explain is very marginal, maybe less than 1%. So hey, it is not worth having 6 factors. Following me? But if we reduce the factors from 5 to 4, then we are, let's say, missing out on 5% or maybe 10% of the variance in personality traits. So 5 factors seem to be an ideal number in terms of the descriptive value that they provide for different personality traits. So that's how we came up with the idea of big 5 personality traits. And the interesting thing, as I mentioned, there seems to be a high consensus across different fields. So we can trust this big 5 personality factors. Remember, reliability and validity, some of the terms that we had discussed before. Now, if multiple studies from multiple disciplines give the same results, then we can trust that data, that result very much, right? So that's a strong reliability. So we are getting consistently same pattern of results across multiple studies. In any case, that's how we came up with the idea of the big 5 personality traits. Now we will go through each of those big 5 personality traits in greater detail. But before I do that, I must mention that each of these big 5 factors could be studied from a very broad overall level, or one could go in depth and study the many sub-dimensions that also exist within each of these 5 factors. So most textbooks, of course, talk about these factors, each of these factors from a broad overall level, from a bird's eye view perspective, right? If, for instance, we are talking about openness, because ocean, so O is the first letter. So if we talk about openness first, they will give a broad definition about what openness is. But if we want to delve deeper, we will find that openness actually has many sub-dimensions. So there are 2 different models, almost similar to each other, but each of those models have 6 sub-dimensions within each of those factors. Each of those 5 factors have 6 sub-dimensions. We call them facets. And some of the recent research actually has tried to find a healthy medium between these 2 extremes. And that has 2 sub-dimensions or 2 facets within each factor. Now, given the time constraints, I won't delve deeper into all the 6 facets in my presentation here. Openness is short for openness to experience. And openness is the tendency to be informed, creative, insightful, and curious. So people who tend to be high on the openness personality trait They tend to be curious individuals. They like to learn new things, or they may like to learn more about whatever it is that they are learning. They like to go deeper. And because of this, they may be actually very well informed about the matter that they are interested in. They may also have then some interesting insights about their subject of interest, right? Because of how much deep they are really interested in going. These people, they tend to be creative individuals. They like engaging in creative activities. They tend to be imaginative. So that's what we broadly mean by the openness dimension. The next trait that we will talk about is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is the tendency to be thorough, organized, controlled, dependable, and decisive. So people who tend to be high on the conscientiousness dimension, they tend to be people who work hard. They do not run away from work, okay? And whatever work that they are working on, they like to do a thorough job of it. They also tend to be very organized individuals, so they try to keep everything systematic. Because of this hard-working nature, because of they being very organized, they become very dependable individuals, right? And you would depend on such a person. This would be a person who would keep his promise. So that's broadly what we refer to when we are talking about the conscientiousness personality trait. The next personality dimension would be extroversion, which is the tendency to be sociable, assertive, and to have positive energy. So people who are high on this dimension, they tend to be called extroverts. Who are low on this dimension, they tend to be called introverts. People who are high on this dimension, they tend to be social individuals. They like interacting with people. They also tend to be more assertive. They assertive, especially verbally. They are very they don't hesitate expressing whatever it is they are interested in. And these individuals, they tend to have a lot of positive energy as well, meaning that they have a tendency to experience positive emotions. Now, this does not mean that the introverted individual experiences negative emotions. No. Introverted individuals have a lower tendency to experience positive emotions. So when we are talking about negative emotions like anger, jealousy, envy, we are actually talking about a completely different personality trait, which is neuroticism. So when we are talking about extroversion, we are talking about our tendency to experience more positive emotions like joy, happiness, being cheerful. So people who tend to be high on the extroversion dimension, they tend to be more joyful, they tend to be more cheerful individuals, they tend to like interacting with people. Who are lower on this dimension, the introverted individuals, they have a lesser tendency to experience those positive emotions. They tend to be a little less social, or if they are strongly introverted, then completely asocial. The next dimension is agreeableness, which is the tendency to be accepting, conforming, trusting, and nurturing. So people who are high on the agreeableness dimension, they tend to be very trusting individuals. And by that, I mean that they trust people easily. I'm not saying that they are trustworthy individuals. They could be, but being trustworthy means you can depend on somebody. The somebody who is a trustworthy person means that you can rely on this person, you can depend on this person. And that is, if you would remember, associated with the conscientiousness dimension. When we are talking about trusting here, we are referring to the person easily trusting others. Okay, so that's what we mean by trusting here. People who are high on agreeableness, they are also very nurturing individuals. They like to help others. They like to be invested in the growth of others. They tend to be accepting of other people's faults. So that's broadly what we mean by agreeableness. if you are low on the agreeableness dimension, you don't trust people easily. You are like a Machiavellian personality. You are manipulative. If I take the extreme case of somebody being really low on agreeableness, that would be a person who is a jerk or an asshole, doesn't care about anybody. So that would be the lower end of agreeableness. So the last big five personality trait left for us to discuss is neuroticism, which is the tendency to be depressed, anxious, insecure, vulnerable, and hostile. In simple words, neuroticism is the dimension referring to people's tendency to experience negative emotions, or most negative emotions, if not all. And people who are low on neuroticism, they have lesser of a tendency to experience negative emotions. Okay, so it's not that they are happy. If we are talking about happiness, then or experiencing positive emotions, then we would be talking about the extroversion dimension, right? So when we are talking about neuroticism, we are talking about the tendency to experience negative emotions. One thing to keep in mind, the term neuroticism may give the impression of this being a psychopathology, somebody being diagnosed with neuroticism. But that's not what we are referring to here. We are talking about the personality dimension. We are not talking about the psychopathology called neuroticism. In other words, we all are neurotic to varying extent. We are talking about the personality trait of neuroticism. As I have mentioned before, there are numerous studies that have been done examining the relationship between the big five personality traits and leadership. And you would imagine that these different studies may show different results. So how do we figure out the exact nature of the relationship between the big five personality traits and leadership? One way to approach is to take a look at what we call our meta-analytic studies. So the result that I'm sharing here is from a 2002 meta-analysis published by Tim Judge and his colleagues. Meta-analysis, if you don't know, it does essentially a quantitative summary of the all other studies that have been done on the same subject. Now, it is not just a mathematical average of those correlations. It's much more complex than that. It's actually the actual process is extremely complex, but the way to think about it is that it essentially does an average of all those studies. But it takes into account the sample size of each of those studies, what all variables have been studied in those studies. It takes into account the reliability scores of those measures in different studies. Not all studies may be equally reliable, right? So taking into account multiple factors, and analyzing all that data from those different studies, we then come to a conclusion about what is likely to be the real relationship between any two variables. And in this context, it's between the big five personality traits and leadership. So without delving too much into this technical discussion, let's focus on the relationship. So first thing that we see is that we find a strong relationship between the personality traits and leadership. And when it comes to the big five personality traits, the most strongly associated trait turns out to be extroversion. Then it is conscientiousness. That's the second most related factor with leadership. Next comes openness. Next is neuroticism, but it's related negatively, right? So the more neurotic you are, the less likely you will be a leader, or the less likely you will be effective as a leader. So it's negatively related. If we instead of the term neuroticism, if we use the term emotional stability, then it would be a positive relationship. So the more emotionally stable you are, the more likely you are to be a leader, and more likely you are going to be effective in your role of leadership. And the last dimension is agreeableness. So this is the trait that is least related to leadership, or it is the correlation is still positive, but the correlation is weak. Okay, so it is weakly related to the idea of leadership. Let's take a look at one of the original tables from Judge's paper. Now, if you are not trained in statistics, this table can, of course, be overwhelming. So to make things simple, I will ask you to focus only on this column, row. The numbers that you see here actually are the correlations between the big 5 personality traits and leadership. Okay, so what do we see here? We see here that extroversion is the most strongly associated with leadership, with the correlation of 0.31, followed by conscientiousness, 0.28, followed by openness, 0.24, followed by neuroticism in the negative direction, also 0.24, and the trait that is the least correlated with leadership is agreeableness, with a correlation of 0.08. Now, it is not exactly 0, but the correlation is weak. I'm saying it is not 0 because the confidence intervals are still in the positive direction, but that's going into technicalities. So the trait that is very weakly correlated with leadership is agreeableness, and the trait that is most strongly correlated with leadership is extroversion.